I didn't catch on right away that I was making a huge mistake. In that moment, everything seemed so exhilarating, forbidden, and absolutely irresistible. But now, looking back, I realize that was the first crack in the delicate life I had been carefully crafting for years. You might think you know where this is headed, but trust me, there are twists and turns you won't see coming. Even I couldn't have predicted how it would all unfold. My name's Sarah, and this story starts in our cozy little home on the edge of a small town where life used to move along smoothly and predictably. I had a family most would call picture perfect, a loving husband, a beautiful house, and a son with a bright future ahead of him. But then one day, everything shifted. That's when Trevor came into our lives. He was my husband's nephew, but the way he looked at me that first night stirred something in me that I hadn't felt in a long time. And that's where my story begins, with that look. But believe me, this is just the beginning. I was standing by the kitchen sink drying the last glass when I heard a car pull into the driveway. It was my husband, Mike, coming home after a long day at work. As usual, he looked worn out, and the first thing he did when he walked in was head straight for the fridge, looking for something cold to drink. His once thick hair now had streaks of gray at the temples, and the years of hard work were etched into his tired face. "Hey, babe," he said with a smile, but the spark that used to light up his eyes was gone. "Hey, Mike," I replied, placing the glass on the rack. We exchanged a quick glance before I drifted back into my thoughts. Over dinner, he mentioned his plans for the weekend. His nephew, Trevor, would be staying with us for a few days. Trevor was the son of Mike's younger brother, and although they didn't see each other often, they'd always been close. I remembered him as a teenager, tall, lanky, with an awkward smile, but it had been years, and now he was in his 20s. I just nodded, trying to push down the growing unease I felt. The next day, as expected, Trevor arrived. The first time I saw him, he was stepping out of his car, heading toward the house with a suitcase in hand. Right away, I noticed how much he'd changed. He carried himself with a confidence that hadn't been there before. He was taller and broader than I remembered, and his hair was neatly cut. As he walked up to the door, he smiled at me, and I felt a blush creeping up my cheeks. "Hey, Sarah, you look amazing," he said, pulling me into a hug that lingered just a little longer than it should have. My heart started racing, and I quickly looked away, feeling a bit unsettled. "Hey, Trevor, come on in, make yourself at home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though inside I was a mess of emotions. We walked into the house, and I showed him to the guest room, doing my best not to stare. But I couldn't help noticing the way his eyes followed my every move. Mike, as usual, was buried in his work, and Trevor quickly settled into our home. He was attentive, always helping out around the house, and spent time with us during dinner. But every time he was near, I felt a strange tension, like the air between us had thickened. It was as if he noticed every gesture, every glance, and I started to feel there was an unspoken connection between us that I couldn't and didn't want to break. One evening, we were sitting out on the porch, soaking in the warmth of the night breeze. Mike had already gone to bed, leaving me alone with Trevor. He lit a cigarette, and as he looked at me, he asked, "Have you ever thought that life isn't just black and white?" "What do you mean by that?" I replied, feeling a strange sensation stir deep within me. Sometimes we view the world in such narrow, rigid terms that we miss out on all the other shades in between. There are moments when desires and passions drive us to do things we wouldn't dare say out loud, he said, exhaling a cloud of smoke into the balmy evening air. I froze, trying to mask how deeply his words had affected me. For the first time, I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something big, something risky and exhilarating all at once. That night was the start of something that would turn my entire world upside down. The next morning, when I woke up, the conversation we had on the porch still echoed in my mind. I tried to dismiss it, convincing myself that it was just an innocent exchange, but the feeling that something inevitable was brewing had already taken root inside me. Throughout the day, I found myself unconsciously searching for Trevor, anticipating our next encounter, craving to hear his voice again. Mike was at work, and I was home alone. Trevor was busy with his own tasks in the guest room, and the house was filled with a strange, stifling silence. I tried to distract myself by cleaning and making lunch, but thoughts of him kept creeping back over and over again. By evening, Trevor suggested we take a walk. His offer caught me by surprise, but I quickly agreed, hoping the fresh air and conversation would steer me away from these unwelcome thoughts. We strolled along the path that led into the woods behind the house. The sun was setting, casting the sky in warm hues of orange and pink. Trevor seemed at ease, his voice gentle and soothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper behind his calm exterior. You know, Sarah, I've always admired you, he suddenly said, cutting through our casual talk about everyday things. What do you mean? I asked, surprised, trying to conceal the embarrassment creeping into my voice. You're an incredibly strong and beautiful woman. I realized that when I was a teenager, but now, seeing you again, everything feels more real, more tangible. His voice was earnest, and I felt my heart start to race. I stopped walking, feeling how Trevor's words awakened emotions in me that I had buried long ago. It was dangerous, yet at the same time, impossible to resist. Trevor, this isn't right, I whispered, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from his face, from the intense gaze that held a mix of passion and desire. Why not? You've been hiding your feelings for so long. Why can't you allow yourself to feel happy, even if it's just for a brief moment? He stepped closer, his breath brushing against my skin. Inside, two opposing forces clashed. One screamed at me to stop, to run away before it was too late, while the other drew me toward him, making me forget everything: consequences, morality. I knew this was wrong, but the pull of passion was too strong. And then, in that moment, as the evening air grew almost unbearably thick, Trevor leaned in and, without waiting for my response, gently kissed me. That kiss was like a bolt of lightning. It lit up everything around us, filling me with an energy I hadn't felt in years. His lips were soft, yet assertive, demanding a response. I couldn't resist the urge. We stood there at the edge of the woods, hidden from the world, and it felt like time had come to a standstill. My hands instinctively wrapped around his neck, and I pressed myself against him, allowing myself, if only for a moment, to forget reality, to forget that this moment was forbidden. When we finally pulled away from each other, his eyes still held that same intense fire, but now there was an understanding between us. He knew that this kiss had shifted everything. We both knew it. I tried to speak, to find some way to explain myself, but the words wouldn't come. Sarah, he began, but I quickly cut him off. Please don't say anything right now. I need time to sort all this out, I whispered, and breaking free from his embrace, I hurried back to the house. I could feel his eyes on me, burning into my back, but I didn't turn around. That night felt endless. Mike came home later than usual, and I did everything I could to act normal, but inside, I was a mess. Trevor stayed in his room, and luckily we didn't cross paths. But I knew deep down that the moment we shared on that path by the woods was just the beginning. How could I have let this happen? Why couldn't I stop it? The answers to those questions would come later. But for now, I was left alone with my thoughts and the memory of his lips, of how he made me feel so alive. The next few days passed by in a haze. I tried to keep myself together, to pretend that everything was as it always had been, but inside I was in chaos. Trevor was considerate, but kept his distance, as if he understood that I needed space to process what had happened. Yet every time our eyes met, I felt the same spark, the one that had ignited on that path. Mike either didn't notice the changes or chose to ignore them. He was absorbed in his work, and our conversations had become more formal, lacking any real emotional connection. That had been fine with me before, but now, after what happened with Trevor, I felt the emptiness in our relationship more intensely. One evening, when Mike stayed late at work again, Trevor suggested we drive into town to pick up some groceries. I agreed, hoping it might help distract me. We drove in silence, with only the soft hum of the music in the background, and despite my efforts to stay calm, the tension in the car grew with each passing minute. As we walked into the supermarket, his hand brushed against mine by accident, and that simple touch sent a surge of adrenaline through me. I pretended not to notice, but inside I was in turmoil. We went about gathering groceries, chatting about trivial things, but our words felt hollow because we both knew we were thinking about something else entirely. After shopping, Trevor suggested we stop by a lookout point that offered a view of the entire city. I hesitated, knowing this could lead to something I'd been trying so hard to avoid, but despite my inner protests, I nodded. By the time we arrived, the sun was starting to set, casting the city below in a golden light. We stood there side by side, taking in the view, and I felt my heart begin to race. Trevor turned to me, saying nothing, but his eyes locked onto mine with a mixture of passion and determination. "Sarah, you know how I feel about you," he said quietly, but with absolute certainty. I sighed, trying to hold back what felt inevitable. "Trevor, this is wrong. We need to stop before we go too far." "Do you really want to stop?" he asked, stepping closer. His voice was deep, and I could feel my resolve starting to crumble. I knew what I should say, that I should tell him yes, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stepped forward, and without thinking about the consequences, I pulled him close and kissed him again. This kiss was different, more urgent, deeper, carrying with it all the passion I had been holding back for so long. His arms wrapped tightly around me, and I felt everything inside me unraveling with desire. When we finally pulled apart, I noticed his breathing was just as ragged as mine. We both knew there was no turning back now. "Sarah," he started, but I cut him off again. "No words right now. Let's just allow ourselves to be who we really are," I said, taking his hand and leading him back to the car. We drove in silence, but it was a silence thick with anticipation. When we got home, I went straight to my room, knowing this night would be a long one. But despite everything, I felt more alive than I had in years. When Mike announced he'd be leaving for a week-long business trip, I felt a rush of mixed emotions. On one hand, it was nothing new. His job often took him away, and I was used to his absences. But this time was different. Now, with just Trevor and me left in the house, I knew this week would be more than just a routine period of solitude for both of us. As soon as Mike's car disappeared around the corner, I realized I didn't feel anxious or afraid. Instead, I felt a sense of liberation, the chance to finally be myself without having to hide my feelings. Trevor, standing nearby, seemed to sense the moment too. His eyes met mine, and I saw the same impatience I felt within myself. We no longer bothered to keep our distance or avoid each other. On the contrary, with Mike gone, everything had shifted. It was as if invisible chains had been lifted, and now we could savor every moment that was ours alone. This house, which once felt so empty and quiet, had become our little world where there was no room for prohibitions or limitations. On the very first evening after Mike left, the atmosphere between us changed. I was preparing dinner, and Trevor sat in the kitchen watching me. There was a blend of tenderness and passion in his gaze, and I felt his presence fill the space around me with a special kind of electricity. "Sarah," he began, stepping closer. His voice was soft, but there was a note of certainty in it. "Now that we're alone, I want to be honest. I can't pretend anymore that there's nothing between us." I turned to him, my heart pounding. "I can't either," I admitted, holding his gaze. There were too many unspoken words between us, and now finally, the moment had come when we could give in to everything. Trevor moved closer, and without waiting for me to say anything more, he wrapped his arms around me, and I felt his lips on mine again. This kiss was filled with all the passion we had stored up during those days of restraint. Now there was no need for self-control. We could enjoy each other without thinking about the consequences. After dinner, we stayed on the porch, enjoying the warm evening air. Trevor sat beside me, his hand gently holding mine, and I felt a calmness mixed with a sharp desire wash over me. "How long are we going to keep hiding?" he asked, his voice full of hope and longing. I looked at him, knowing the answer wasn't simple, but in that moment, with Mike far away and us alone, it didn't matter. We could live in the present, enjoying each other without worrying about what came next. "Let's just stay in the here and now," I said, and in my words was all the freedom we had finally found. That night, we stopped hiding from our emotions. Trevor held me close, and I felt his hands explore every curve of my body with a mix of tenderness and passion. We allowed ourselves to be who we had always longed to be. Every kiss, every touch was charged with deep emotions I had kept buried for so long. Morning crept into the room softly like a gentle breeze, barely stirring the curtains. The first rays of sunlight filtered through, casting a soft glow over the bed. I was still asleep, lulled by the calm of the night, and didn't hear the door to my bedroom quietly open. Trevor stood at the threshold watching me, his gaze a blend of tenderness and passion that drew me to him so powerfully. He approached the bed slowly, careful not to break the silence, but with each step, his desire grew more evident. He knew this moment was inevitable, and now, as the morning began to chase away the shadows of the past, he felt our time had truly come. As he leaned over me, I was still asleep, my face relaxed, my hair spread across the pillow. Trevor gently ran his hand along my cheek, his touch so light it was almost imperceptible, as if he was afraid to disturb my sleep. But I felt that tender gesture, and without waking, I instinctively turned toward him. My skin immediately responded to his touch, and Trevor felt his heart quicken. He couldn't wait any longer. Leaning closer, he softly kissed me on the lips, at first cautiously, as if testing whether I would wake, but I didn't open my eyes, and that encouraged him. His kiss deepened, became more insistent, and finally I began to wake. I felt the warmth of his lips and slowly opened my eyes to see him before me. In those first moments, I was disoriented, but then the same feeling I had tried to suppress surged within me. Trevor looked at me, his eyes filled with desire and determination, and I knew there was no point in resisting. "Good morning," he whispered, his voice low and husky, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. "Good morning," I replied, my words barely leaving my lips before he kissed me again, this time with more passion. I felt his arms wrap around me, pulling me closer. His warmth enveloped me, and I could no longer hold back. I responded to his kiss, pressing myself against him, feeling as though everything inside me was catching fire. His hands were everywhere, exploring every inch of my body with a tenderness and hunger I had never known before. I felt my fingers tangle in his hair, my breathing quicken, and all my thoughts dissolve into this moment. Trevor gently lifted me, his movements confident and full of passion. He lay down beside me on the bed, not breaking the kiss, his hands slowly gliding down my neck and across my shoulders, as if he wanted to memorize every curve of my body. I felt his fingers begin to remove my clothing, each touch sending an electric shock through me. We were caught up in the moment, lost in our desires and the passion we could no longer hide. He looked at me, his gaze burning with intensity, and I knew this was the moment we had both been waiting for. I felt my body respond to his touch, my thoughts growing hazy with desire. Trevor leaned down, his lips trailing slowly down my neck, causing me to arch toward him, and I felt my body begin to tremble. I couldn't hold back the moan that escaped my lips. This moment was filled with a desire we couldn't ignore. Finally, he lifted his head and looked at me, his breathing uneven, his eyes glowing with passion. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick with the emotions that had overtaken us both. The moment felt like an explosion, as if everything inside me was igniting. I felt his body become one with mine, and all my thoughts, all my doubts, evaporated. Trevor moved slowly, his actions filled with both tenderness and passion. We were one, and this moment was ours alone. Our bodies moved together, each of his thrusts sending waves of pleasure through me, washing over me with renewed intensity. I could no longer think, could no longer hold back. There was only feeling. Trevor felt it too, and each of his breaths, each moan, echoed my own desire. When it was over, I lay beside him, our bodies still trembling from the experience. I looked at him, and in his eyes, I saw the reflection of my own feelings: happiness, contentment, and the understanding that we could no longer deny what had happened. "I can't be without you anymore," he whispered, his voice hoarse and filled with emotion. "Neither can I replied, and in that moment I knew our world had changed forever. Now that we were together, I couldn't imagine going back to the life I had before this morning. A couple of days passed since that morning when Trevor and I stopped holding back and allowed our feelings to take over. Those days were filled with passion, tenderness, and a sense of complete freedom that we let ourselves fully enjoy. The house, which once felt so quiet and empty, was now filled with our laughter, conversations, and endless touches. We cherished every moment as if we knew it couldn't last forever. On the morning of the third day, when I woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. I made my way down to the kitchen, where Trevor was waiting for me with a cup of coffee and his usual smile. He approached me, hugged me from behind, and kissed my neck, his lips leaving a trail of warmth on my skin. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to sink into the moment, feeling his breath on my skin, savoring the closeness we now shared. "We still have a few more days," he whispered, his voice soft but full of the joy of us being together. I smiled, leaning back against him, feeling his arms wrap around me. "And each one will be special," I replied, and in those words was all my certainty that this happiness was well deserved, even if it was forbidden. We spent the morning together, wandering aimlessly around the house, talking about trivial things, but in every conversation there was a lightness and closeness that I had been searching for so long. Trevor was attentive, his glances, his gestures, all spoke of how much he valued every moment with me, and I responded in kind. After lunch, we settled on the couch in the living room. Trevor turned on an old movie, but neither of us paid much attention to it. He pulled me closer, and I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling his arm wrap around me. Inside, I felt a deep sense of happiness, and I was certain that nothing could spoil this moment. Trevor leaned in towards me, his lips once again finding mine, and in that moment, everything else faded away. We kissed, our bodies becoming one again, and I knew this kiss was a promise we had made to each other. But then, in the next instant, I heard a sound that made me freeze. The door. It had closed, and I felt a cold rush through me. We both pulled away from each other and turned toward the door where Mike had just walked in. He stood in the doorway, his suitcase still in hand, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. At first, he seemed unable to grasp what was happening, but then his gaze shifted to us, to the way Trevor still had his arm around me, to our lips that had just been together. "What's going on here?" Mike finally asked, his voice filled with disbelief and shock. His eyes darted between us, as if trying to comprehend the scene before him, but the truth was already plain to see. Panic surged within me. The entire world Trevor and I had built over these past few days collapsed in an instant. I saw the look in Mike's eyes and knew that no explanation, no words, could undo what had already been done. "Mike, I began, but the words caught in my throat. I had no idea what to say, no way to justify myself to him. In that moment, I saw the pain, the betrayal, and the anger etched into his expression. Trevor slowly released me, his face pale, equally lost for words. This moment had always loomed over us, but nothing could have prepared us for its arrival. "How could you?" Mike dropped his suitcase to the floor, his voice trembling with the raw emotion coursing through him. "How could you, Sarah? And you, Trevor, my own nephew." I saw the anguish twist his face. All the years we had spent together, all the trust and love he had given me, were shattered in an instant, and I knew there was no going back. "Mike, please forgive me," I whispered, my words drenched in guilt that had finally come crashing down on me. But he wasn't listening. His eyes told me something inside him had broken. "Forgive?" he repeated, his voice hollow, empty. "Do you think a simple apology can make everything right?" Trevor took a hesitant step forward, but Mike raised his hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Don't come near me," he said, a steely edge in his voice that made us both freeze. In that moment, I realized our lives, our family, would never be the same. Everything we had built over the years was destroyed in a single devastating moment. I looked at Trevor, and in his eyes, I saw the same pain and understanding. We couldn't justify ourselves, couldn't undo what had been done. Mike stood before us, his eyes darting between Trevor and me. It seemed as though he couldn't quite believe what was happening right in front of him, but his face was set with a firm resolve. He was no longer the man I knew. Pain and betrayal had transformed him in an instant. "Get out," he said, his voice cold and detached. His words struck like a physical blow, leaving me breathless with dread. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Mike no longer saw us as his family. His eyes reflected only anger and deep disappointment. "Mike, please, let's talk," I pleaded, but he silenced me with a gesture that cut through the air. "No, Sarah, there's nothing left to talk about." His voice was laced with pain, but also a grim determination. You both betrayed me. I don't want to see you anymore. Pack your things and leave. Trevor took a step forward but stopped, recognizing that Mike wasn't going to relent. Uncle, I'm sorry, he said, but the confidence that had once defined him was gone. Sorry? Mike scoffed, his laugh bitter and filled with hurt. Is that all you have to say? You've destroyed my family and now you're sorry? I stood beside Trevor, feeling a wave of despair wash over me. Everything I had tried to build with Trevor was crumbling before my eyes. I looked at Mike, knowing no words could heal his pain, and that our time in this house had come to an end. We silently walked upstairs to pack our things. I could feel Trevor beside me, but the closeness we once shared had already vanished. Everything felt surreal, as if I were trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. When we came back down, Mike was standing by the door, his face grim but his gaze unwavering. He no longer saw me as the woman he once loved, and in that moment I understood that I had lost not only the house, but also the life we had built together. We stepped out of the house, and Mike closed the door behind us. The sound severed us from the past, and now we stood on the edge of the unknown, unsure of what would come next. The air outside was cool, and I shivered. Trevor stood next to me, but his gaze was fixed somewhere in the distance. I looked at him, trying to understand what he was feeling, but his face was unreadable. Trevor, I began quietly, not knowing how to express the turmoil inside me. What do we do now? He looked at me, his eyes filled with sadness, but the fire that had once burned there was gone. Sarah, I'm not sure that anything serious can happen between us. His words hit me like a blow, almost knocking the wind out of me. What are you saying? I whispered, barely able to believe what I was hearing. We made a mistake, he continued, avoiding my eyes. I don't think I can keep this going after everything that's happened. I felt my world collapsing all over again. What I had thought was the beginning of a new life turned out to be just an illusion. But you said you couldn't live without me, I murmured, my voice filled with desperation. But he just shook his head. I thought I could, but now I see it was wrong. We both made a mistake, and I don't want to make it any worse. I looked at him, struggling to comprehend how this could be happening. Just a few days ago, we were so close, but now I was standing in front of a man who was ready to leave me. Tears began to stream down my cheeks, and I felt everything inside me breaking apart. But I love you, I whispered, hoping those words would change something. He shook his head again, and in his eyes I saw the pain he couldn't put into words. Sarah, I care about you, but this isn't something that can go on. We need to stop before it gets even worse. I couldn't believe what he was saying, but deep down I knew he was right. I stood there, feeling the cold seep through my clothes, realizing I no longer had a place to go. I was alone, without a home, without a husband, and now without the man I thought could replace all of that. Trevor slowly stepped away from me, each movement heavy with the weight of his decision. Goodbye, Sarah, he said before turning and walking away, leaving me standing alone in the cold, with the wind cutting through the last remnants of my hopes. I wandered down the street, not knowing where I was headed. My legs carried me forward, but my mind was in turmoil. Everything that had been part of my life had crumbled in a single moment. The home I once saw as my refuge was now closed to me. The husband I had trusted with my life had thrown me out, and Trevor, who had become a symbol of passion and hope, had left me in solitude. Everything I thought was real had turned out to be an illusion, shattered in an instant. I stopped at the corner of the street, unsure of where to go next. The cold wind cut through me, and I felt my body stiffen from the chill, but it was nothing compared to the icy terror gripping my heart. The world around me seemed empty and gray, devoid of the colors I once saw. Everything had lost its meaning. Tears streamed down my cheeks, and I couldn't stop them. I tried to understand how I had come to this. How could I have made such a mistake, losing everything that mattered? I thought back to those moments of passion with Trevor, the feelings that had felt so real at the time, and realized they were now nothing more than ghosts of the past, impossible to reclaim. I found a secluded spot in a small park and sat down on a bench, wrapping my arms around myself as if trying to ward off the cold that had settled in my heart. Images from the past flashed through my mind: my home, Mike, his smile, our life before everything went so wrong. I thought about how we had loved each other, how we had built our family, but now it all seemed so distant, as if it wasn't my life, but someone else's dream that had long since ended. The world I had so carefully constructed now lay in ruins, and I didn't know how to piece it back together. Every breath felt like a struggle, and inside me a void was growing, expanding with each passing moment. I understood that I had made mistakes that couldn't be undone, and now I was alone, facing the consequences of my actions. The pain of loss was unbearable. I had lost not only Mike, but also a part of myself, the woman who had once been confident, who had believed in love and the future. Now I was just a shadow, lost in this cold world where there was no longer a place I could call home. I thought about Trevor, about his words that nothing serious could happen between us. In that moment, I felt my heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. I had believed he could be my salvation, but now I understood it had been nothing more than a desperate attempt to escape a reality I couldn't accept. He wasn't the one who could fill the emptiness inside me. He had been just a fleeting moment, bright but brief, leaving me in even greater darkness. Sitting on that bench, I felt time slow down. Life continued around me. People walked by, but it all felt distant, foreign. I was alone in a world that no longer felt like mine, and in that solitude I realized I was facing a long and difficult journey, a road filled with regrets and loss. I didn't know if I would ever be able to forgive myself for what had happened, but I knew one thing. I had to find the strength to keep living, even if the world was no longer the same. It took several hours before I could finally stand up and move on. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing. This day had changed everything, and I had to find a way to live with it, no matter how hard it would be. I took that first step, and despite all the pain that tore at me, I knew it was a step toward a new life, no matter how difficult it might be.